I have tidbits. Are you ready for the historical tidbits section? We've been talking about some of these, and they've been very popular. And as I mentioned, we plugged Rock Rims earlier. We'll plug Scott Teal again and crowbarpress.com, who has reissued, or not reissued, but issued a compilation of classic St. Louis wrestling programs from 1943 through 1951. And when we talked about those, that made me go back to my volumes, the famous St. Louis Wrestling Club office set that I have in my possession, and go through some more in the following year, because 1951, 52, 53 was right during the middle of the network television boom, and wrestling was quite hot in most parts of the country. St. Louis, as we've talked about, had been majorly successful all through the World War II years and the rest of the 40s, something that some of the cities in the country couldn't say, but now TV has blown up and it's settled in. And we've mentioned before the guys that were the big stars of the Dumont Network show out of Chicago, which was the big one. They're, the highest paid professional athletes in the country, but the world heavyweight boxing champion made in those days more money than pretty much any professional athlete in the United States. And the next four spots were pretty much all taken by professional wrestlers in those days. You're a baseball fan. What kind of money was a pro baseball player making in 1952?
Ooh, off the top of my head, I don't have an answer. $100,000 would probably be the very tops. But
I think you ought to look that up, because I think you'll be surprised, because I don't think it's that much. And I know we've heard the stories about the NFL salaries in the 50s and 60s, as a matter of fact, which is why that so many guys, they weren't the absolute star players in the NFL, but they were definitely top players, Wahoo McDaniel, Ernie Ladd, guys like that started wrestling in the off seasons and then decided to do it full time, because the pay in the National Football League in those days was negligible compared to not only to what it is now, but even to what top wrestlers were making.
What year did you say?
1952.
52. Okay, it went down. It's interesting. Just to give you a little bit of just to show you a little bit of where it was. 1948, the top baseball salary was $65,000 for both Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. In 49, Joe DiMaggio got $100,000. $100,000 again in 1950, and then a pay cut. $90,000 in 1951. 1952, Ted Williams is paid the most amongst baseball players, $85,000.
Okay, now look up football in your little Google machine there, because the NFL players were making much less, and those were the biggest stars in baseball at that time, right? That was the biggest.
Oh, Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio? Yeah, they were. Yeah. I mean, Joe DiMaggio was finishing out his career, but those were the two biggest stars of that generation.
So your average schlub second baseman on the, bottom half teams was probably at $15,000, maybe. And the football salaries were not there yet. The reason why that the wrestlers were paid so well in comparison is because the wrestling payoff philosophy had actually devolved from the way it was in the 30s, when guys like Strangler Lewis or Jim Londos would get major chunks of the gate on the events in order to wrestle, because they were the clear draws and, nobody else was in their league. It actually devolved that guys in the 50s were getting less as a percentage of the gate, but because of the amount of shows being run and the amount of work that they could get and the amount of matches they could be booked in, and the fact that, wrestling was still, back in those days and still in the 80s, almost always run on a shoestring, you could make more money as a pro wrestler than a top pro wrestler than you could at almost any other professional sport in the world. Did you find anything on football yet before we go into some of this?
No, it's not as easy to find as baseball because baseball has people who put up a lot more information.
Yeah, well, also because you know a lot more baseball sites, I'm sure. But I mean, you'll any football fans out there that have read some of the biographies of the guys from the 50s and 60s, we're talking major names that you would think were taken care of that weren't making 20 grand. So anyway, we had been talking about the St. Louis attendance, but I've got some figures not only for St. Louis, but also a few things in Chicago, some ephemera about the ticket prices, and also a little bit about the NWA champion. And I'd asked the question when we did this a show or two ago. I said, well, hey, how many tickets did the WWE sell in their entire company-wide in 2019 before the pandemic? How many live event tickets? And I had two people answer me with two different answers, but they were close. One said 1.2 million and one said 1.4 million. And that sounds about right with what you've heard with stockholders reports and these conference calls and et cetera. I would think that's certainly in the ballpark, right?
Probably. Does that count Saudi Arabia? Because that's a different animal altogether.
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether that would count Saudi Arabia or not, because they were special shows. But anyway, okay, so what were they getting in Saudi Arabia? 60, 70,000 in the stadium?
It was a stadium, so I think it would probably be
okay.
That, yeah.
Well, then let's. How many shows they have in Saudi Arabia in 2019?
I have to look that up.
Well, let's go ahead and give them, instead of 1.2 to 1.4, let's give them 1.5 million. There's 2 or 3 stadium shows. And that sounds great until you realize that they're by far the biggest promotion in the country, in the world, and nothing else in this country comes close in terms of their reach. And that's 1.5 million tickets for the entire year. Now, we know in 1974, we've talked about Memphis selling almost 400,000 tickets just in the Mid-South Coliseum. But in St. Louis in 1951, and remember, Brian, they started seasonal wrestling in, what was it, the late 40s, early 50s in St. Louis, where they would not run May, June, July, and August, and maybe even September. They'd run everything from October through April. And those were the days when they were running. Those shows would be every week. They would alternate between Tom Pax and Sam Muchnick's outfit. But anyway.
Sam wanted to watch the Cardinals, so they should.
There you go. And that's why these programs are so valuable, because as we've mentioned, with Muchnick being a former journalist and a sports writer, and them trying to make wrestling as sports-like and legitimate as possible, they have these quotes from newspaper articles. We quoted something from the Wall Street Journal that they had on one of these segments before. They also have athletic commission gates and attendance figures and legitimate ticket prices. They try to make it like the other ring sport besides boxing, where they're really playing it straight. So you get facts and figures that, you wouldn't have gotten in some of the other territories because they didn't give a fuck. And they just, hey, Bob Luce's program, blood, death, fear. But anyway, in 1951, for 7 months in St. Louis, there were no shows May through September, but for 26 events in the other months of 1951, they'd sold 200,000 tickets. The average attendance was 8,000 per event. And the St. Louis ticket prices for the house shows were $3 down to 75 cents. And they had 5 different levels because the Kiel Auditorium was a massive old place, and some seats in some locations were better than others. So they had 5 different price levels, but it was $3, $2.25, $1.50, $1, and general admission was 75 cents. And in 1951, 52, 53, with the inflation calculator that we like to use, you can times everything by about 10 because it equals about $10.60 something cents in today's money. So that was basically $32 down to a little under $1 or a little under $10 for their ticket prices, which wasn't bad compared to what they are these days. The Chicago International Amphitheater. Just if anybody wanted to know, that's where the big stuff was taking place in Chicago on the Dumont Network at that time. They were more expensive. The ticket prices there at the International Amphitheater, Brian, $3.90 ringside all the way down to $1.30 general admission. And they had a capacity of 12,000 fans. That would be somewhere around $41, $42 down to about 14. The Marigold Gardens, however, which also did TV tapings for the Dumont Network, had 1,800 seats, and the prices were $2.50 down to $1.25. Fascinating, eh?
This goes into something you brought up before, but I have a big collection of Wrestling As You Like It and Wrestling Life, but especially the early years. It's amazing how much was happening in Chicago.
Yeah.
At one time. Multiple shows a week, stars everywhere, 2 different promotions, TV everywhere.
We've talked about, up to 4 and 5 live events per week in Chicagoland, in the metropolitan Chicago area, where there was Marigold Gardens, there was Rainbow Arena, the International Amphitheater. They also went out to, as far as Hammond and Gary, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. Some information on the Gagne-Thez rivalry. People will remember that Lou Thez was the NWA champion. Vern Gagne had been an NCAA wrestling champion in the United States. Same thing that Kurt Angle did, same thing that Brock Lesnar did. But Vern Gagne had done that in the late 40s. And when he turned pro, it was with a huge push, and he was made the United States champion out of Chicago by Fred Kohler off the Dumont Network. And he was starting to rival the NWA champion in terms of drawing power and popularity because of that strong TV. And Kohler was trying to and did succeed for some time in sending Gagne out as the U.S. champion with the same deal that the NWA World Champion did. The NWA champion in those days got 10% of the gate after taxes of the event that he was on, and Gagne was getting. That's where Gagne made the money to go back to Minneapolis a few years later and buy into the territory. Gagne was probably, besides Thez, the highest paid wrestler in the business for a couple of years there, and the heat over Gagne and Kohler really trying to supplant the NWA champion as the number one touring guy and get the same money is why that the NWA never put the title on Gagne, and he finally ended up making his own in the AWA because he was at that level at that point. So just for example,
it should have been Gagne instead of Hutton.
Yes, because
Thez was insistent that it was going to be Hutton.
Gagne was every much as legitimate a wrestler as Dick Hutton, because Dick Hutton was an NCAA champion and he was an amateur great, but he didn't draw any money as a professional. He was boring and he didn't have it, whereas Gagne had been huge and had the wrestling credentials, but they tried to do the NWA's gimmick and they didn't appreciate it, which and Gagne made it for the people in Minnesota and people in his home area. When he went there and started the AWA, he made it legitimate by saying, everybody knows that I haven't had an NWA title match in the past 3 years. The champion has ducked me. I'm issuing this challenge. If he does not meet me at such and such time, it made it real. And it was like he was the victim, the put upon guy that couldn't get a chance because the champion was scared of him. So that's what made him in his territory.
It worked out for all parties because Vern and Wally Carbo having the AWA, which was geographically a pretty significant size territory
Yeah.
helped the NWA with their antitrust issues.
Yeah, that's true, because they could say, well, look, they're all over. They're as big as we are, but the AWA got the Dakotas, right? So that's 7 people in 2 states. Anyway, but during the time where Gagne was first getting hot as the U.S. champion, Thez was the NWA champion, they did meet in Chicago in 1952. I believe that's the match that's on YouTube, and drew a $26,000 house, which was a sellout at the International Amphitheater. But $26,000 in 2021 is $266,000. That's a gate at the International Amphitheater in a town that was running 4 live events a fucking week in its metropolitan area. That was just the big show at the amphitheater. For when they were were they weekly back then, or was it every 2 weeks still?
I have to go back and check. I thought it was weekly, but I have to go back and check. At the International Amphitheater, it may have been 2 weeks.
I think it was every 2 weeks, but they were all over the place anyway. Here's just a little run in 1952 for you. As I mentioned, St. Louis was running every week. 1 week would be a Muchnick show. 1 week would be a Tom Pax / Martin Thez promotion show. And these are not all of the events. I got a few attendance figures. On January 11th, Lou Thez versus the Mighty Atlas drew 10,933. On February 22nd, Thez versus Bobby Manigoff, 10,295. March 7th, 1952, Gagne versus Ray Eckert, 10,928. March 21, 1952, Thez versus Manigoff again, 10,213. March 28th, Thez versus Gagne in St. Louis, 11,663 people. That was a sellout at the Kiel Auditorium, paid $19,210. That would be the equivalent of right at $200,000 today. And that was at the end of the month when they had run 3 shows beforehand, drawing over 10,000 people. And here was an interesting statistic. Vern Gagne, according to this report, was set to make over $70,000 in 1952, which would be equivalent to $717,687 in 2021. And that would, where did that put him? Right at Ted Williams, or was it the other fella you talked about?
It put him right at Lake Minnetonka. No, it put him right at, I believe it was Ted Williams for 52, yeah.
Okay, so yes. And that's when Gagne was still on the way up. This is a nice statistic for 1952. This is for St. Louis. In 29 shows from January through April and September through December, because as I mentioned, they had a season, they sold 208,952 tickets for $268,000 at the gate. 29 shows, 208,000 fans. That's about, 9,000 or 8,000 average. But that 268,000 at the gate translates to $2,750,000 in today's money in one city in a 8-month period. It also mentions that in 1951, Lou Thez defended his title 55 times. Now, that does not say that's all he wrestled. That was the NWA title defenses. And when we remember, 1951 was before a lot of the territories formed and were running 7 nights a week, and there were no interstates, and Thez didn't like to work tank towns, and he had the power at that point. So I would imagine that he probably wrestled less than 100 times overall, counting TV tapings, non-title matches, whatsoever. And he was claiming that he earned right at $100,000, which would be $1,025,000 in today's money. And honestly, that's not a ridiculous estimate when you consider that he got 10%. And 1951 was not as big as 52. We're going to talk about that in a second. But it was still, they drew major gates in Chicago and in St. Louis and in Houston and all the big places the NWA champion would work. And that, Strangler Lewis, 25 years before that, was getting bigger payoffs per show, but there weren't as many shows. But now, because there's all these shows running, the NWA champion is pretty much the highest paid guy in wrestling. And as we've seen, one of the highest paid guy in pro sports. But he didn't have to wrestle 300 plus days a year like the NWA champion did in the 70s. So you see, the pattern is wrestlers started out in the 30s making a fucking fortune. And then they were still making a lot of money, the top ones in the 50s, but they had to work more for it. And then by the 70s and 80s, they were making more money, but they had to work 3 times as much. Are you catching this pattern, Brian?
Yeah, and I just pulled up one of my random issues here of Wrestling As You Like It. July 14th, 1951, Elephant Boy and Slave Girl on the cover. So this is just 1 week, because this came out every week.
Yeah.
So this is 1 week in Chicago. On July 14th at the Marigold Arena, Rudy K versus Chief Lone Eagle, 2 out of 3 falls. George Doucette versus Zach Malkov. And Hombre Montana and Roman Cernadas versus Bob Clay and Gene Bowman, 2 out of 3 falls. George Craig versus Ned Taylor, that's the 14th. On the 16th, once again at the Marigold Arena, George Doucette versus Leon Kirilenko, 2 out of 3 falls. Hombre Montana and Ramon Cernadas, once again against Al Williams and Bozo Brown. Bozo Brown, wow.
Bozo Brown, Frank Spaceman Hickey.
Yeah, 2 out of 3 falls. Lee Savaldi versus Carl Engstrom and Bob Geigel in the opening match versus Zach Malkov. So that's July 14th and 16th, both at the Marigold. And then there's an ad here also for, let me turn the page, Friday, July 13th, so in between those shows, or no, right before that.
Right before.
First show. Lake County Stadium, Round Lake Park, Illinois, where there's wrestling every Friday night. Vern Gagne versus Lone Eagle in the main event. The NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion versus the Indian Star. Plus Rudy K and Al Williams versus Hombre Montana and Raymond Cernadas and George Doucette versus Bozo Brown. And then here, listen to this. Here's Wrestling on TV in 51. On Saturday, it's on at 8:30, Wrestling from the Marigold Arena. Doesn't look like it's on Sunday. On Monday, it's on at 11 o'clock, Wrestling with Russ Davis. On Tuesday, it's on at 11 o'clock, Wrestling with Russ Davis. On Wednesday, it's on at 8:30, Wrestling with Wayne Griffin, followed by, at 9 o'clock, International Boxing and Wrestling, followed by Wrestling with Russ Davis at 11. On Thursday, you have Wrestling at 10 p.m., Wrestling at 11 p.m. with Russ Davis, and on Friday, once again at 11, Wrestling with Russ Davis. That's all in 1 week in Chicago.
And there was no International Amphitheater show that week.
And actually, hold on, I have a note here. Glad you brought that up. I just saw this when I was flipping through here. Kohler to feature major mat cards. Promoter Fred Kohler plans on featuring several major wrestling shows in the International Amphitheater in the fall. Dates are now being sought by the promoter at the arena.
Well, and speaking of which, what year was that? Was that 51 or 52?
51. It was July 14th, 51.
Okay, well, in 1952, just so we know, one of those, or two of those International Amphitheater events, Thez versus Gagne on January 25th, 1952, drew $25,712. And in Chicago, actually, this was outdoors. June 20th in Chicago, Thez versus Pat O'Connor drew $35,717 because there was a piece on Thez's box office power. And in 7 matches in 1952, and I know you're going to know one of them, Lou Thez versus various opponents grossed $323,347 at the gate, which in 2021 would be $3,315,173. In Chicago, January 25th, Thez Gagne 25,712. March 1st in Milwaukee, Thez versus Killer Kowalski, 26,718. In St. Louis, April 11th, Thez versus Gagne, 22,617. June 20th, Chicago, Thez O'Connor, 35,717. July 5th, Los Angeles, you know this one, versus Baron Leone.
That's right.
The all-time gate record to that point in time for pro wrestling, $103,517, and that was 25,400 people, according to the report. I've heard 23,000, but a contemporaneous report said 25. Anyway, November 12th, Los Angeles. Again, Thez indoors, Thez versus Rocca. $51,670, which that alone is over $500,000 today. And November 18th in Madison Square Garden, Thez versus Mr. America Gene Stanley, $57,396. So in 7 matches in 1952, Lou Thez was main evented almost $3.5 million in today's money of gate receipts, but he would have made, at his 10%, roughly 30 grand on those 7 matches.
And just to speak to how much he got around, obviously this probably wouldn't be a big gate, but I have here the program, August 31st, 1952, Civic Auditorium, Honolulu, Hawaii's first World Championship Wrestling match with Lou Thez. So he got over to Hawaii in 52 also.
And, well, as a matter of fact, if you want to know a little bit about what the NWA World Champion schedule was like, I believe this was the end of 1951. I was getting sleepy, and I didn't write it down specifically. But this is not to say this is all of the matches that he had, but these are the high points, and I would think this is probably, like I said, in the days before the interstate, and Thez didn't like to work the tank towns. But if you think he wasn't making a fucking fortune, November 12th, the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. So it's 1952. I'm sorry. November 12th, Los Angeles Olympic Auditorium. November 18th, Madison Square Garden. November 21st, St. Louis at the Arena, the big building, not the Keel. November 27th, Kansas City. December 2nd, San Francisco. December 7th, Honolulu. December 9th, Indianapolis. So Honolulu to Indianapolis before jet planes. December 12th, Chicago. December 17th, Vancouver. December 18th, Seattle. And December 23rd, Minneapolis. So in 6 weeks, he's gone from literally from one end of the country to the other and back again and out in the Pacific. And you know, those were all major shows. Did you know, by the way, when the pile driver and why the pile driver was barred and declared illegal in the state of Missouri, which I believe was the first place to declare it illegal because Longson had just invented it?
No, I don't know the story behind that, no.
Apparently, the reason, the time that the pile driver hold was first declared illegal in wrestling was in the state of Missouri by the Missouri Athletic Commission after the November 22nd, 1942 match between Bill Longson and Strangler Lewis. Strangler Lewis, the aging legend and St. Louis fucking icon, he was injured by the pile driver. They did an injury angle. They brought Longson in 1941 and started getting heat on him. And then they bring Lewis in and he takes the pile driver and stretchers probably, I guess, and they declare the pile driver illegal. And from then on, Longson uses it to get heat behind the referee's back, the way that it happened then in all wrestling. Behind the referee's back, injure the babyface, get heat, cheat, whatever. And finally, after Longson's incredible run there in St. Louis, when he starts becoming somewhat of a babyface because he's been there so long and he's been such a top guy, by 1952, he was asking the promoters for a championship match against Lou Thez. They'd traded the belt back and forth over the previous 10 years, but to make the pile driver legal in that match so that he has his best hold to go against Thez. It was all a fucking, they were smart from the beginning. Get the hold over, make it so dangerous, take it away, and then let this fucking guy that's a box office bonanza use it to get heat. And in this same program where he's doing this, they mentioned that between 1941 and 1951, Longson had just passed the milestone of selling 1 million tickets in St. Louis alone in a 10-year period to his main event matches. That's long-term booking, fans. And did you know why that St. Louis never had a 2 out of 3 fall world championship match until modern times, until way after the 1950s?
I don't. Was it an athletic commission thing?
Not really. But because this blew me away also when I started reading the fine print. Everybody thinks that in the old days, world title matches were always 2 out of 3 falls, and then they became 1 fall, right? That's a modern thing. And in most territories, those people that say that would be correct. But in St. Louis, because St. Louis was so entrenched in history and one of the last parts of the country to actually give up the original habits and parameters and rules and etc., St. Louis world title matches were always what they called finish matches. A finish match was their phrase at that time for a match with no time limit. It's going to go till the finish, right? It's going to go till somebody wins. That's why you would see in the 20s and 30s, the days of Lewis and Stecker and all those guys, matches going 4 and 5 hours, right? Because there was no time limit to them. And back in those days, before the big sports arenas, a lot of the money in wrestling was in betting. And said they'd have somebody in the crowd. Well, I bet he's going to beat him in the next 30 minutes. Well, I bet he won't. Whatever the fuck. They were working, right? Just a different way. But St. Louis kept that tradition of a match for the world championship has to be a finish match. Therefore, they would never book 2 out of 3 fall matches on the theory that it would be unbelievable because some matches may go an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Remember the old days? Well, we'd be here all night. And then finally, as modern times came in, Gagne was here in 1953 demanding a 2 out of 3 fall match with Lou Thesz because he knew that Thesz may catch him once, but he couldn't beat him twice in the same night. And the people are shocked because a 2 out of 3 fall world title match? Well, that's blasphemy. It's fucking, they made everything mean something. Now we got chaos. Anyway, 1 million tickets, by the way, in one city in a 10-year period, just in your main event matches. How about them apples?
Won't see that again.
You know what? It's enough to drive me to distraction and make me need to talk to somebody. But I will not do the normal spot that I do because I have testimony from one of the Cult of Cornette listeners, John, in Murfreesboro. I got this email just, when I was able to check my email a few days ago when we got the internet back. And I won't read everything, but just the bottom line of it. As someone working in the music business, COVID decimated my industry and my income. And I, like many, turned to alcohol to self-medicate and wound up drinking myself into the hospital more than once in the past year and a half. Realizing that I needed to make a change, I considered therapy, but in the past I've failed because it seemed every therapist wanted to use religion as the cure, whether for depression or alcoholism or whatever. And as an atheist, I simply couldn't work this out. But on a whim, I took your advice to give BetterHelp a try, and I'm happy to say that the therapist BetterHelp matched me with is not only brilliant and wonderfully helpful through the tough times, but he also uses a science-based approach that doesn't appeal to any invisible men in the sky. Because he was able to talk to me on my level, I finally felt I had the strength of support to become sober, and I'm now at 78 days sober, and I'm exceedingly proud of that accomplishment. And I feel confident in saying that I wouldn't have achieved anything like that if you guys hadn't suggested BetterHelp. And that's from John in Murfreesboro, but hopefully it goes for anybody that's taken our advice and given this a whiz. The folks at BetterHelp are committed to professional counseling done securely online with a broad range of expertise that you can log into your account anytime, send messages to your counselor, schedule the sessions. You know the drill, guys. You've heard from John. Take a swing at it. Go to BetterHelp, HELP, betterhelp.com/drive, DRIVE. and join the over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. And you can get 10% off your first month's services when you use that code word, betterhelp.com/drive. The special offer for the Cult of Cornette, 10% off your first month's services at BetterHelp.